Ethan stepped up to the counter, sliding his ID and account details across to the bank teller. She took them without a word, her fingers gliding over the keyboard as she pulled up his records. The soft glow of the monitor reflected in her eyes as she reviewed the information, her expression giving nothing away. "Just a moment, Mr. Preston," she said, her tone polite but distant. With a few more keystrokes, she confirmed the transaction, finalizing the closure of his mortgage. A quiet whir filled the space as the printer came to life, spitting out a crisp sheet of paper. She retrieved it, stamped it, and slid it across the counter toward him. "Here's your final account statement," she said, meeting his gaze briefly. Ethan took the paper, his fingers running over the embossed bank seal. It was done. The house, the debt, the ties to his past, officially closed. With a nod of thanks, he turned and walked away, leaving behind the last remnant of a life he no longer wanted. 17 years. 17 years of early mornings, late nights, extra shifts, and sacrificed vacations. Years of pouring everything into securing this home, and now, in one fleeting moment, it was done. "Congratulations, Mr. Preston," the teller said with a polite smile. "Your mortgage is officially paid in full." Ethan nodded, murmuring a quiet, "Thank you," before slipping the document into his coat pocket. As he stepped through the glass doors of the bank into the cool evening air, a gentle breeze whispered through the streets, carrying the distant hum of traffic and the faint scent of rain. This should have felt like a victory. He should have felt light, relieved. But instead, a strange weight settled deep in his chest. Perhaps it was exhaustion, or maybe something more, something he couldn't yet name. But tonight wasn't about him. Tonight, he would do something selfless, something to secure his wife's happiness and, by extension, the fragile peace within the family he had spent years trying to be a part of. The house was theirs now, or at least, that's what they would believe. That evening, the dining table was set with elegance. Sophia had gone all out, lighting candles, arranging a spread of their favorite dishes. There was warmth in the air, the kind that masked the cold truths lurking beneath the surface. Ethan sat across from her, his hands loosely wrapped around his wine glass. She looked radiant tonight, her auburn hair pinned in an effortless updo, her lips painted a soft shade of red. She had always been beautiful, always carried herself with a confidence that made people listen when she spoke. But lately, something had shifted. A distance had crept into their conversations. She was present, but not in the way she used to be. Still, he pushed the thought aside. Tonight was a celebration. Reaching into his coat, he pulled out an envelope and placed it gently on the table. Sophia's eyes flickered with curiosity as she set down her fork. "What's this?" she asked, intrigue lacing her voice. "Open it," Ethan said with a small smile. She lifted the flap and pulled out the documents. As she read through them, realization dawned on her features. "Ethan," her voice faltered. "Is this?" "The house is yours," he said softly. "I've transferred ownership to your family. No more debts. No more payments. It belongs to you now." For a moment, Sophia simply stared at him, her expression unreadable. Then, slowly, a smile spread across her lips. Not just any smile, but one that reached her eyes, a rare sight these days. "Ethan, this is incredible," she breathed, a soft laugh escaping as she shook her head in disbelief. "I don't even know what to say." "Say nothing," Ethan replied gently. "Just be happy." And for the first time in what felt like forever, he thought he saw something close to genuine warmth in her gaze. Sophia wasted no time calling her parents, her siblings, everyone. Within minutes, the living room filled with voices, cheers of excitement echoing as her family arrived. They hugged her, clapped Ethan on the back, their gratitude enthusiastic and effusive. "You're a good man, Ethan," Sophia's father said, gripping his shoulder firmly. "Always knew you'd take care of our girl," her brother added with a grin. Ethan smiled politely, nodding where necessary. But beneath the surface, something gnawed at him. The way they spoke, the assumption that he had simply fulfilled an obligation, as though he had owed them this. It sat uneasily in his mind. Excusing himself, he stepped into the dimly lit hallway. From the corner of his eye, he saw Sophia and her mother embracing, their voices hushed yet brimming with elation. "This means everything, Mom," Sophia whispered. "We'll finally be free." "And Ethan just handed it over?" her mother asked, a trace of disbelief in her tone. "He's always been easy like that," Sophia replied with a light laugh. Ethan froze. "Easy like that." The words replayed in his mind, twisting into something sharper than intended. His pulse quickened, but outwardly, he remained composed. They thought they had won. They had no idea. Buried deep within the fine print of that document, hidden beneath layers of legal jargon no one had bothered to read, was a single clause, a safeguard. A quiet, unnoticed power still resting in his hands. One signature, and everything would revert back to him. He had given them their dream, but he had not given away his power. For now, he let them celebrate, let them bask in the illusion of victory. But deep within his chest, something dark stirred. Somewhere, he knew, tonight was the beginning of the end. The house was alive with laughter, the air thick with the scent of roasted meats and spiced wine. Soft music hummed in the background, weaving through the conversations. It was meant to be a celebration, the final triumph of Ethan Preston, the man who had spent 17 years paying for a home he had just given away. But the celebration felt hollow. Standing near the fireplace, Ethan swirled the dark liquid in his glass, watching the scene unfold before him. Sophia moved effortlessly through the room, the perfect host, her smile radiant as she flitted from guest to guest. Her parents lounged on the couch, already discussing renovations, their house, their plans. Her siblings laughed loudly, drinks in hand, swapping childhood stories as though they had always belonged here. Ethan should have felt pride. He should have felt warmth. Instead, a quiet unease pressed against his ribs, heavy and suffocating. He wasn't sure when it started. Maybe when Sophia barely looked at him tonight, acknowledging him only in passing with a fleeting smile. Maybe when he realized that, in their eyes, he had done nothing more than fulfill an expectation. Or maybe it had started long before that. Maybe it was the way her brothers, Nathan and Brandon, had been watching him all night, not with gratitude, but with something else. Something that looked a hell of a lot like amusement. And then came the moment that changed everything. Sophia tapped the rim of her glass with a fork, the soft chime cutting through the hum of conversation. The room quieted as all eyes turned to her. She stood at the center of the living room, a vision of elegance in her deep red dress, her lips curving into the kind of self-assured smirk that Ethan had once found intoxicating. Everyone, a toast, she announced. An eager hush fell over the crowd, the air charged with anticipation. Ethan felt it like static before a storm. To my incredible husband, Ethan, Sophia continued, raising her glass, who has worked tirelessly for years to give us this gift, this beautiful home. We are finally free, thanks to his dedication. A murmur of agreement rippled through the room, glasses lifted in celebration. Ethan nodded, raising his own in response. But then, and now that we have financial freedom, Sophia's lips curled, her tone light, almost playful. I think it's time to open the marriage. I need some excitement. Laughter erupted. Wine sloshed in glasses. Nathan and Brandon chuckled knowingly. Their mother covered her mouth in mock surprise, and someone near the back whistled. But Ethan, he didn't laugh. He stood frozen, the words sinking into him like jagged glass. The world tilted, the noise distorting into a distant hum. Across the room, he saw Nathan nudge Brandon, both of them smirking, as if they had been waiting for this. As if it had been discussed. As if it had been planned. Sophia's eyes flicked to his, gauging his reaction. She expected him to play along, to laugh it off like a good sport. For a fraction of a second, he considered it. Considered slipping the mask into place and pretending this was just another joke among family. But something inside him snapped. Not in rage. Not in heartbreak. In clarity. With careful precision, Ethan set his glass down. The laughter swirled around him, but he barely heard it. He took one step back. Then another. Sophia's smile faltered slightly. Babe, I was just joking, she started. But Ethan was already turning away. Without a word, he walked past the guests, past the laughter, past the clinking glasses and the smug glances of people who had never truly seen him as one of them. He reached for his coat, slipping it over his shoulders with slow, deliberate movements. Then, without looking back, he stepped out the front door. The cold night air hit him like a slap. He welcomed it. Stepping onto the sidewalk, he inhaled deeply, letting the crispness wash away the suffocating weight in his chest. Behind him, the party continued. The music played on. The glasses clinked. His absence went unnoticed. Except by one. His phone buzzed in his pocket. He pulled it out, glancing at the screen. Unknown caller. He knew exactly who it was. With a smirk, one they couldn't see, he let it ring. Then, slipping the phone back into his pocket, he kept walking. Because what they didn't know, what none of them knew, was that their celebration was built on borrowed time. And tomorrow, the debt would be called in. The hotel room was dim, bathed in the cold blue glow of the city lights pressing against the window. Ethan Preston sat on the edge of the bed, his phone buzzing relentlessly on the nightstand. He didn't answer, didn't even look at the screen. He already knew who it was. Sophia, her family, maybe even a few of their so-called friends. But he wasn't interested in what they had to say. Not now. Not ever. He leaned back, exhaling slowly, his fingers laced together as he stared at the ceiling. The events of the night replayed in his mind. Sharp, Clear, undeniable. The laughter, the smirks, the way Sophia had orchestrated it all, expecting him to be nothing more than an afterthought in his own life. They thought they had won. They thought he would crawl back. They had no idea what was coming. Morning came too quickly. The phone had stopped ringing sometime after 2 a.m., but Ethan never slept. He didn't need to. At exactly 7 a.m., he picked up his phone. Not to return calls. To make one of his own. James. It's time. There was a pause on the other end before the smooth, measured voice of his lawyer, James Whitman, responded. Understood. Are you absolutely sure? I've never been more sure of anything in my life. Then let's proceed. Come by my office in an hour, and we'll finalize everything. Ethan hung up, his heart steady, his resolve unshakable. This wasn't revenge. This wasn't anger. This was justice. The law firm was quiet when Ethan arrived. James Whitman, a man he had trusted for nearly a decade, greeted him with a firm handshake and an unreadable expression. You look like a man with a plan, James observed, leading Ethan into his office. I am, Ethan replied. He sat across from James, watching as the lawyer pulled out 2 thick folders, each representing the legal actions that would dismantle Sophia's world in a single morning. James flipped open the first folder. As per the contract you signed when you transferred the house, the revocation clause is ironclad. It allows you to reclaim the property at any time, without contest. Since you were the sole financial contributor to the mortgage, there's no loophole for them to challenge this. He handed Ethan a pen. All I need is your signature. Ethan didn't hesitate. The ink glided smoothly as he signed his name. Done. The house was his again. Sophia and her family were living in a dream that was about to become a nightmare. The world tilted. Sophia's stomach twisted into knots. No, this couldn't be happening. With shaking hands, she grabbed her phone and dialed Ethan. No answer. She tried again. Straight to voicemail. She tried her brothers. Nothing. By the time she called her parents, she could barely breathe. Mom, something's wrong. Ethan, he took everything. A stunned silence. Then, her mother's voice, laced with fear. What do you mean, he took everything? Sophia's fingers clenched around the phone. The money. The house. He planned this. Her mother sucked in a sharp breath. Sophia, what did you do? Sophia didn't answer. Because for the first time since this all began, she knew exactly what she had done. And there was no going back. The morning sun bathed the grand house in golden light. But to Sophia, it felt cold. Unforgiving. Her hands trembled as she clutched the eviction notice, her eyes darting over the legal jargon she could barely process. The words blurred together, but the message was painfully clear. They had 1 week to leave. This has to be a mistake, she murmured, her voice unsteady as she turned to her brothers. They stood by the kitchen counter, their faces dark with disbelief. Lucas, the eldest, snatched the papers from her hands, scanning them with a scowl. His jaw tightened. This isn't a mistake, Sophia. His voice was grim. He planned this. Their mother paced the room, clutching her robe tightly around her frail frame. And for the first time, Sophia felt it. The weight of everything she had set in motion. How could he do this? Sophia whispered, her voice barely audible. She swallowed hard, her mind racing. Ethan had been angry last night. She knew that. But to go this far? To take back the house they had just been celebrating in hours before? No, he wouldn't do this to me. Shaking her head, she muttered, he loves me. Lucas scoffed. Loved you, he corrected, his tone flat. Past tense. And you handed him the perfect excuse to walk away. Sophia shot him a glare. Don't start with that. But deep down, she knew. She had pushed too far. The party, the toast, the laughter. She thought it was harmless fun. She thought he would storm off, cool down, and return like always. But this time, Ethan wasn't coming back. She didn't wait. She couldn't. With shaking hands, Sophia grabbed her coat and keys, heading straight to Ethan's office downtown. The drive felt like a fever dream. Her mind spun with possibilities. Maybe it was a misunderstanding. Maybe he'd had too much to drink and made a rash decision. Maybe he just needed to hear her side of things. But when she arrived, she wasn't prepared for what she saw. Ethan was already outside. Dressed in a sharp navy suit, he leaned casually against his black sedan, arms crossed, watching her with calm, knowing eyes. A chill ran down her spine. This wasn't the man who had once worshipped the ground she walked on. This wasn't the man who had given her everything. This was someone else. Someone who had already decided her fate. Sophia stormed up to him, heels clicking sharply against the pavement. What the hell is this, Ethan? She demanded, waving the eviction notice in his face. He didn't flinch. I think it's pretty clear. You're kicking us out of our home. Her voice rose, shrill with disbelief. Ethan tilted his head slightly. You mean my home? Her stomach twisted. That's not fair. You gave it to us. No, Ethan cut in smoothly. I let you borrow it. Her breath hitched. It was a joke, Ethan. Her voice softened, turning almost pleading. What I said last night, it was just a joke. Ethan studied her for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then, finally, he spoke. I didn't find it funny. For words. That was all he gave her. Sophia blinked, thrown off balance. Come on, she forced a laugh, trying to lighten the mood. You know me. I was just messing around. You're overreacting. Ethan's expression darkened. Am I? He asked quietly. Sophia opened her mouth to respond, but no words came out. Because deep down, she knew. He wasn't overreacting. He was simply done. You don't mean this, she tried again, stepping closer. You can't just walk away from everything we built together. Ethan exhaled slowly, as if he had already prepared for this conversation. You're right. I can't walk away. Sophia's eyes lit up with hope. Exactly, so let's just. That's why I made sure you did. Her stomach dropped. Ethan stepped back, opening his car door. You have 6 days left, Sophia. His voice was calm, final. I suggest you start packing. She stood frozen, watching in stunned silence as he got into the car, started the engine, and drove away. He never looked back. And for the first time, true panic set in. Because she finally understood. This wasn't just anger. This wasn't just payback. This was the end. The first few days blurred into a haze of confusion and desperation for Sophia and her family. The looming reality of eviction pressed down on them like a gathering storm, suffocating and inescapable. They scrambled for a way out. Some loophole, some oversight on Ethan's part. But he had been too careful. Every legal document was airtight, every financial asset locked away. There was no way back. And then, the real nightmare began. Ethan sat in his office, gazing out over the sprawling city skyline. 17 years. 17 years of building everything. His career, his financial security, his marriage, only to be reduced to a cruel joke at a dinner table filled with people who had never truly respected him. Time to open the marriage, Sophia had said, laughing. His jaw tightened. She thought he was weak. They all did. Not anymore. Ethan picked up his phone and dialed Mr. Preston. A deep voice answered. It's time, Ethan said. Find out everything. I want the full truth. The man on the other end didn't hesitate. Consider it done. Ethan exhaled slowly, his grip tightening around the armrest of his chair. He had been too trusting, too blind. Not anymore. It didn't take long. 3 days later, Ethan had his answers. And they were worse than he had imagined. The report sat neatly bound in a manila folder on his desk, but the words inside might as well have been written in fire. Sophia had been cheating on him. For months. Maybe longer. And her family? They knew. They had encouraged it. They had laughed in his face, fully aware that the day would come when Sophia would make her grand announcement. The party wasn't just a joke. It was calculated. Her brothers had smirked that night because they had already welcomed the other man into their circle. They had expected Ethan to do what he always did, stay quiet, accept it, keep providing. They had underestimated him. Ethan closed the folder, his heartbeat eerily steady. This wasn't just betrayal. This was war. The door slammed behind her as Sophia stormed into her mother's living room, her face twisted with frustration. He's not answering my calls, she snapped. Her mother, a frail woman with graying hair, wrung her hands anxiously. Maybe you need to apologize again, sweetheart. Tell him I did, Sophia cut in, exasperated. 100 times. He just looks at me like I'm nothing and walks away. From the couch, Lucas scoffed. That's because you handled it wrong, he said. You should have softened him up first, not humiliated him in front of everyone. Sophia whirled on him, furious. Oh, now you're an expert? She spat. This was your idea. Lucas held up his hands. Hey, we didn't think he'd actually leave. The guy was obsessed with you. We thought he'd be too weak to walk away. Sophia sank into a chair, rubbing her temples. Well, he did. And now we're losing everything. Her mother looked between them, her voice trembling. Do you think he knows? Lucas frowned. Knows what? The words sat heavy in the air. They all knew what she meant. Did Ethan know about the affair? Did he know just how deep the betrayal went? Sophia's stomach twisted. No, she said quickly, shaking her head. He just wants to punish me for the party. But Lucas didn't look convinced. We need to find out how much he knows, Lucas muttered. Sophia exhaled sharply, a sinking dread settling into her bones. For the first time since Ethan had walked out of that party, she felt something deeper than panic. She felt fear. Ethan watched from across the street, his expression unreadable. The private investigator had been thorough. Sophia's movements, her family's desperate discussions, he knew everything. And yet, she was still blind. Still assuming this was about the party, about a stupid joke. She had no idea. Turning away from the window, Ethan walked toward his car. He had one more move to make, one that would ensure Sophia never found a way back. He wasn't finished yet. The house that had once been the heart of Sophia's family now stood empty. its grand presence reduced to nothing more than a hollow shell. The eviction deadline loomed closer, and reality hit them like a sledgehammer. The once proud family, who had mocked Ethan behind his back, laughed at his expense, was now crumbling. And Ethan? He watched it all unfold from a distance. Detached, unshaken, utterly unbothered. It started with whispers. Sophia's mother wept in the kitchen of her sister's cramped apartment, humiliated that after years of wealth, they were now begging for places to stay. Her father, the same man who had once puffed his chest in pride over his daughter's perfect marriage, refused to speak to her. Every time he looked at Sophia, his jaw clenched tighter, his silence louder than any accusation. But it was her brothers who unraveled first. "This is your fault," Lucas hissed, slamming his fist on the table. Sophia recoiled, glaring at him. "Excuse me? You heard me," he snapped. "You stood up at that damn party and humiliated him in front of everyone. What the hell did you think was going to happen?" Sophia scoffed, shaking her head. "It was supposed to be a joke, Lucas." You all laughed. "Yeah," he shot back. "Because we thought he'd take it like he always did. We didn't think he'd." Lucas gestured wildly around them. "Destroy us." Michael, her younger brother, sneered. "You should have just kept cheating quietly. Why the hell did you need to rub it in his face?" The words stung. "You're acting like this is all on me," she snapped. "None of you ever respected him. You were all in on it." Lucas let out a bitter laugh. "Yeah, but we didn't marry him, Sophia. You did." Her hands trembled. They were turning on her. Days ago, her family had worshipped her, encouraged her, laughed with her. Now, they looked at her as if she was the one who had burned their empire to the ground. And maybe she had. Ethan felt no sympathy. Not anymore. Seated in his sleek apartment, he sipped his whiskey, his phone buzzing endlessly on the table. Sophia. Sophia's mother. Her brothers. One after another, the desperate calls came relentlessly. He let them ring. Ignored. Deleted. He had no use for their pleas. No intention of undoing what he had done. And yet, he already knew, Sophia wasn't the type to give up easily. So when he heard the knock at his door that evening, he wasn't surprised. He took his time answering. And when he finally opened it, there she was. Sophia stood in the doorway, dressed immaculately in a sleek black dress that clung to her curves. Her makeup was flawless, her lips slightly parted, the perfect image of seduction. Ethan leaned lazily against the doorframe, tilting his head. "Really?" he said, unimpressed. She smiled, stepping closer, her fingers trailing along his chest. "Baby," she whispered, her voice dripping with sugar. "We don't have to do this." Ethan watched her carefully, his expression unreadable. "Do what?" Sophia's smile faltered, just for a second, before she recovered, tilting her head, her fingers toying with the buttons of his shirt. "This whole revenge thing," she purred. "You proved your point. You got your power trip. But we were good together, weren't we?" She leaned in, her breath warm against his neck. "You still want me?" she murmured. For a moment, silence stretched between them. Then, a low chuckle, cold, amused. Ethan reached up, wrapping his fingers around her wrist. His grip was firm, not tight, not aggressive, just enough to make one thing painfully clear. She had lost. He leaned in slightly, so close their lips nearly brushed. Sophia's breath hitched. For a fleeting moment, she thought she had won. And then his words cut through her like a blade. "You disgust me." The amusement in his eyes vanished, replaced by something far worse, indifference. Sophia tried to pull her hand away, but he didn't let go. "Not yet." "Do you really think," he murmured, "that after everything, I would ever touch you again?" Her heart pounded. "Ethan, His grip loosened, and he took a slow step back. "You're pathetic," he said simply. Then, without another word, he shut the door in her face. Sophia stood there, motionless. The rejection hit harder than she expected. She had always been able to charm her way back. Always. But Ethan wasn't the same man anymore. He didn't love her. He didn't hate her. He simply didn't care. And somehow, that was worse. Tears burned behind her eyes, but she swallowed them down, turning away before the weight of her own choices crushed her completely. This wasn't over. She wouldn't go down without a fight. But deep down, a voice whispered, "You've already lost." The hotel lobby hummed with the quiet murmur of travelers, the clinking of glasses from the bar, the occasional shuffle of bellboys pushing luggage carts. Yet, for Sophia Preston, the world outside her mind had fallen silent. She sat at a marble-topped table, fingers wrapped tightly around an untouched cup of coffee, waiting for the man she once called her husband, waiting for a lifeline. Then he arrived. Ethan Preston. He stepped through the revolving doors with quiet dominance, his tailored suit crisp, his watch catching the chandelier's light. Sophia's pulse quickened, not from love, but from the terrifying realization that this was her last chance. She forced a smile as he reached the table. "Ethan." Thank you for meeting me. He didn't return the pleasantries. Didn't even sit. Just stood there. Expressionless. Unmoved. Say what you need to say, Sophia. She swallowed. I made a mistake, she began, her voice soft, pleading. I let people influence me, She reached for his hand. He stepped back. A clear boundary. Her heart plummeted. Look, I know I hurt you. She tried again, her voice shaking. But we built a life together, Ethan. A good one. And I don't want to lose that. I don't want to lose us. He stared down at her. No anger. No resentment. Just nothing. She hated it. I'll fix everything, she rushed on. If you freeze the accounts, give the house back. Ethan exhaled slowly. Then, without a word, he reached into his suit jacket and pulled out an envelope. He placed it on the table in front of her. What is this? She whispered. Open it. Hands trembling, Sophia tore the envelope open, and her world shattered. The first thing her eyes landed on were photographs. Her, another man, laughing together in a dimly lit restaurant, holding hands, kissing. Her breath hitched. Beneath the photos, printouts of text messages. Ethan won't do anything. He's a pushover. Once the house is in my name, we're set. We just need to make him feel small first. Break him a little. Sophia's blood turned to ice. Her mind screamed. Who? Who sent this to him? A private investigator? One of her brothers? It didn't matter. He knew. He had always known. And at the very bottom of the stack, she saw something else. The signed property transfer documents. Her own signature. Her own betrayal. Hand-delivered back to her like a loaded gun. And below it all, one final message, scrawled in Ethan's familiar handwriting. You wanted excitement. Now live with it. Her breath came in shallow gasps. Ethan. But he was already walking away. She shot up from her chair. Wait. She choked out, grabbing his sleeve. For the first time that night, he looked at her. Not with love. Not with hate. Just quiet finality. You made your choice, Sophia, he said calmly. Now live with it. And with that, Ethan Preston turned and walked out of her life forever. Sophia stood frozen, her entire body trembling. It was over. The accounts, gone. The house, gone. Everything she had schemed for, manipulated for, gone. A bitter lump formed in her throat as she slumped back into the chair, gripping the envelope like it was a piece of wreckage from a sinking ship. Around her, life in the hotel carried on. People laughed, clinked glasses, whispered sweet nothings. But for Sophia Preston, the world had never felt so silent. The street outside the house buzzed with tension. A moving truck sat idling at the curb, its metal ramp clanging under the hurried, reluctant steps of Sophia's family as they dragged out their belongings. Boxes piled up on the pavement, some bursting open, spilling clothes and trinkets onto the asphalt. The house, the very one Ethan Preston had worked 17 years to pay off, stood behind them, now an empty shell. Its doors forever closed to the people who had once mocked his kindness. And Sophia stood at the center of it all, numb. Her mother paced, muttering curses under her breath. Her brothers argued over whose fault this was. Her father sat on the steps, staring into the distance, defeated. But Sophia could only watch in silence as her life crumbled, slipping through her fingers like sand. Across the street, Ethan stood by his car, hands in his pockets, watching the spectacle unfold with quiet detachment. Beside him, his real estate agent flipped through a folder, his voice even and professional. The buyer already made the down payment, the agent said. We'll finalize the paperwork by tomorrow. The house is off your hands. And after covering your original mortgage, you'll be left with a sizable profit. Good, Ethan replied. But it was never about the money. Not for him. He had sold the house just high enough to recover his investment. Not a cent more. The rest? Already donated. A local shelter for abused spouses, an act of genuine kindness. Something Sophia and her family would never understand. The agent handed him a pen. Just one last signature, Mr. Preston. Ethan flipped to the last page and signed without hesitation. And with that, the house, the same house Sophia's family had mocked him for working so hard to secure, was no longer his concern. No longer Sophia's either. The agent took the paperwork and, with a polite nod, walked away. And Ethan? He turned his gaze back toward Sophia. She must have felt his stare because she turned her head. Their eyes met across the street. And in that fleeting moment, Ethan saw it, the pure, unfiltered realization dawning in her eyes. It's over. The house was gone. The money was gone. Her family, the very ones who had once laughed at him, who had smirked when Sophia suggested opening their marriage, who had encouraged her betrayal, were now turning on her. Her mother grabbed her arm, voice sharp with accusation. This is your fault, Sophia. If you hadn't been so greedy. Her father shook his head in shame. Her brothers? Already gone, walking away without a second glance. Their loyalty as fleeting as their convenience. And Sophia, for the first time in her life, She stood completely alone. She took a tentative step toward Ethan, but he didn't move, didn't blink, didn't react. He had nothing left to say, and that silence was more powerful than any words he could have spoken. With a slow inhale, he turned away and got into his car. Sophia watched helplessly as he drove off, disappearing from her life for good. As Ethan drove down the familiar roads, a strange sensation settled in his chest. It wasn't regret. It wasn't sadness. It was freedom. For 17 years, he had built a home, a marriage, a future, all for someone who had never valued it. And now he was free of it all. No longer tied to a house filled with lies. No longer shackled to a marriage built on betrayal. His car pulled up to a modern, minimalist apartment complex overlooking the city, his new home. Small, clean, his. Stepping inside, he dropped his keys onto the counter and let out a long breath. No voices, no arguments, just peace. He poured himself a drink, walked out onto the balcony, and watched the city lights flicker like 1,000 new possibilities. He was no longer the man who had tolerated disrespect, no longer the man who had been blind to betrayal. Once, he had been broken, but he had rebuilt himself, stronger, and for the first time in years. Ethan Preston smiled. The crisp autumn air carried the scent of freshly brewed coffee and fallen leaves as Ethan strolled through his old neighborhood, hands in his pockets. Months had passed since he had last set foot here, since the day he signed away the house and walked away from the life that had nearly destroyed him. Yet it didn't feel like home anymore. The streets were the same. The houses stood untouched. But he had changed. He had rebuilt himself. Stronger, wiser, free. As he crossed the street, his gaze drifted toward the corner cafe, the one Sophia used to frequent. Back when she had the luxury of sitting back, sipping overpriced lattes, and complaining about how hard life was. But today, she wasn't sitting. She was working. Ethan almost didn't recognize her. The woman behind the counter, dressed in a faded uniform with exhaustion etched into her features, was not the Sophia he had once known. Her once meticulously styled hair was now pulled back hastily, loose strands slipping free. The manicured nails that had once flaunted diamond rings were now bare and chipped. And her face, the face that had once radiated arrogance and entitlement, was hollowed by the weight of reality. Sophia looked up. Their eyes met. Her breath hitched. And for the first time since that fateful night, she saw him. Ethan watched as emotions flickered across her face in a single heartbeat. Shock, disbelief, shame, and then hope. She tore off her apron and hurried around the counter, nearly tripping over herself to reach him. Ethan didn't move. He just stood there, letting her close the distance, watching her with a quiet patience that only made her more desperate. When she finally reached him, her hands trembled at her sides, wanting to touch him but knowing she had lost that right. I made a mistake, she whispered, her voice raw with something that almost sounded like regret. I was stupid. I let my family get in my head, and I ruined everything. Her voice broke. I miss you. Ethan stared at her for a long, quiet moment. Months ago, those words might have shaken him. Months ago, he might have hesitated, might have felt that old pull toward the woman he once loved. But now he just smiled. Not a cruel smile, not a bitter one, just a calm, knowing smile. The kind that comes from a man who has walked through fire and emerged unscathed. So did I, Sophia. Her eyes lit up, fragile hope flickering to life. Just for a second, until he finished his sentence. But I fixed mine. The hope shattered. Before she could say another word, before she could beg, cry, or bargain, Ethan simply turned and walked away. No final words. No looking back. Because he didn't need to. The past was behind him. And the future was his. As Ethan walked away, Sophia stood frozen, watching his figure disappear down the street. Her chest tightened with the crushing realization. This was it. The last time their paths would ever cross. She had played the game, and she had lost. Ethan didn't need revenge. He didn't need to see her suffer. Because his success, his happiness, that was the final blow. And as he stepped into his car, his reflection in the mirror held a quiet certainty. He had won. Not by fighting, not by seeking vengeance, but by moving on. And in the end, that was the last laugh. And that, my friends, is the power of walking away. Revenge isn't always about getting even. Dear listeners, please share your thoughts in the comments section below, and don't forget to like, share, and subscribe.